spaceflight, it's a thing. Manned, unmanned, monkey-controlled. Whatever it is, we will be talking about that and its history today. So first, we need to explain how rocket engines work. There are two types of rocket engines. There are solid rocket boosters, or SRBs for short. SRBs are powered by a solid propellant. Side note, propellant is what explodes to generate lift. Solid propellant can be something as basic as gunpowder, but for space rockets, it's usually more advanced. Once you start an SRB, you cannot stop it without destroying it. SRBs can either be started by lighting a fuse, like a firework, or, in the case of advanced rockets, can be lighted by a jet spraying out hot gas. The other type of engine is a liquid-fueled engine. Liquid fuel engines are powered by a flammable liquid, usually kerosene or liquid hydrogen. Liquid fuel will not have reaction without being in contact with oxygen, which is why rocket fuel tanks carry liquid oxygen. If you disconnect the fuel from the oxygen, usually by closing a pipe, you can stop a rocket if need be, or making liquid fuel engines much more common and safer. You can also control how much fuel is let out, which means liquid engines are throttleable. This is a major oversimplification. There is plenty of more information that I have left out. The first rockets were created in medieval China and all used solid fuel. These rockets were basically fireworks and were mainly used for war purposes. Rockets remained the same for quite a while. In 1903, Russian scientist Constantine Silkowski, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, created many theories relating to rocketry. He theorized many things that are either used in space exploration today, like space stations and airlocks, or things that the future may hold, like colonies on other planets. Silkowski also created the rocket equation, which is complicated, and I don't think I'm the best person to explain it. Just look it up. He created the problem that if you want your rocket to have more thrust, you have to add more fuel, but to be able to lift that fuel, you need more thrust, and so on. All rocket scientists have had to deal with this problem. In the 1920s, a scientist from Massachusetts named Robert Goddard began theorizing ways to make a throttleable or stoppable rocket engine. He eventually created the first liquid fuel engine and launched the first liquid fuel rocket in 1926. He also came up with the idea to use staging on rockets. Staging is deploying unneeded mass, usually fuel tanks, from rockets once they are empty to lighten the load. In 1930s Germany, a man named Wernher von Braun began to come up with ideas for high-altitude rockets. The only group that was willing to support him was the Nazi party that ruled Germany at the time. Von Braun's rocket, called the V-2, would be primarily used by the Germans in World War II to attack Allied cities in Europe, but a few are used for scientific purposes. In 1944, the V-2 was launched up and crossed the Kármán line, becoming the first man-made rocket in space. After World War II ended, the United States took most of the V-2s and employed Wernher von Braun as a scientist. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, a man named Sergei Korolev invented a new rocket engine. For his thesis to science, he was arrested and sent to a gulag in which he was forced to do manual labor. He was eventually let out and was hired as the Soviets' chief rocketry engineer. The Soviets began to catch up with the Americans, and the Germans began to launch objects across the Kármán line. The US began to launch animals into space. First, they launched fruit flies, but then began to launch monkeys, all of which were named Albert. Most of them unfortunately died on re-entry because of the parachute failing, but it would lead the way for human spaceflight. Tensions began to heat up between the US and Soviet Union. In 1957, the USSR created the first intercontinental ballistic missile that could carry nuclear warheads hundreds of miles extremely quickly. Later that year, America and the Soviets both announced plans to launch the first man-made satellite into Earth orbit. The Soviets beat the Americans with Sputnik 1. The rocket that launched Sputnik was directly based off of the Soviets' pre-existing missile technology. Most early rockets were. Even today, the Russian Soyuz rocket is based off of missile technology. In terms of today's satellites, Sputnik wasn't that good. It only successfully transmitted data for 3 hours and ran out of batteries after just 3 weeks, but it was the first man-made thing in orbit. Later that year, the USSR launched Sputnik 2, which carried along a capsule carrying a dog named Laika, which became the first animal in orbit. Unfortunately, Laika's capsule burnt upon re-entry. In 1958, America launched the Explorer 1 satellite. Explorer 1 carried much more scientific equipment and discovered the Van Allen radiation belt in between the Earth and the Moon. The Soviets launched the Luna probes, which became the first objects to crash into the Moon. The US launched the Vanguard satellites as well as more Explorer satellites. In 1960, the Soviets launched Sputnik 5, which carried two dogs named Belka and Strelka, who became the first mammals to return from space. Later that year, the Soviets launched the Mars 1M, which attempted to be the first spacecraft to reach another planet, but failed to get the correct course. In 1961, the US launched a chimpanzee named Ham into orbit, becoming the first hominid to do so. The Soviets would launch the Venera probes into Venus orbit, and later that same year would launch Yuri Gagarin on Vostok 1, becoming the first human in space. Gagarin would orbit the Earth multiple times before returning. A month later, America would launch Alan Shepard into space on Freedom 7. This mission was rushed to try to catch up with the Soviets, and thus Shepard would not make it into orbit and would only be in space for 15 minutes. In August of that year, Soviet cosmonaut German Titov became the first person to spend more than one day in space. Many in the US began to become worried with the Soviets' lead in space exploration. As a result, then-President John F. Kennedy, in his famous "We Choose to Go to the Moon" speech, set an ambitious timeline for America to land on the moon by 1970, launching the Apollo and Gemini programs. But the Soviets continued to launch Vostok missions. In 1962, America launched John Glenn in the Friendship 7, becoming the first American to orbit the Earth. In 1963, Vostok 6 launched Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space. The USSR modified the Vostok capsule to fit 2 or 3 people, turning it into the Voskhod capsule. They only made the Vostok capsule slightly bigger. In fact, it was so cramped that the crew had to be put on special diets just to fit in their seats. Voskhod 1 was launched, making it the first rocket to carry more than one person. Voskhod 1 carried 3 people, while Voskhod 2 only carried 2. Voskhod 2 carried Alexei Leonov, who became the first man to go on a spacewalk. The mission almost ended in failure when Leonov's spacesuit nearly depressurized, but it was, in the end, a success. The U.S. Gemini program lasted from 1965 to 66 and paved the way for the Apollo programs. The crafts Gemini 6A and Gemini 8 achieved the first orbital rendezvous, and the two crafts became the first to dock together. Other Gemini missions broke records for a person's length of time in space, the longest being 14 days, and completed the first American spacewalk. While America slowly began to take the lead in the space race, the Soviets began to design their Soyuz craft and their N-1 moon rocket. In 1967, the Americans completed the Saturn V, which would launch the Apollo missions. Apollo 1 would end in failure on the launch pad after fire broke out in the capsule, killing the crew of 3. Later that year, Soyuz 1 successfully launched, but its pilot, Vladimir Komarov, died on re-entry to Earth because of a parachute failure. Apollo 8 became the first manned craft to leave Earth orbit and would conduct a flyby of the moon. Apollo 9 and 10 would get into lunar orbit but not actually land. Apollo 11, crewed by Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, would become the first craft to land on the moon, with Neil Armstrong becoming the first man on the moon. Armstrong would say the famous quote, "It's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." The A was muffled and thus the quote makes no sense, but that's how it was meant to be heard. 6 Apollo crafts in total would land on the moon, with a failure on Apollo 13 leading to an error return. The N-1, the Soviet version of the Saturn V, had a catastrophic failure just after a test launch, and shortly after, Sergei Korolev would die of a heart attack and would be replaced by Valentin Glushko. America and the USSR both began to launch space stations. The first of these would be the Soviet Salyut 1, which would shortly be followed up by the American Skylab. Fun fact, Skylab was the site of the first and only strike in space. The crew of Skylab felt overworked and for a day shut down communications and refused to do any experiments. The Americans would only launch 1 Skylab, but the Soviets would launch 10 Salyuts, 3 of which were Almaz reconnaissance stations. Tensions began to weaken between the US and USSR. In 1975, the Apollo-Soyuz test project happened, in which a Soyuz craft docked with an American Apollo craft, partially ending the space. After the Apollo program ended, there was a major drop in funding for American spaceflight. As a result, NASA came up with the idea for a reusable spacecraft. That craft would be the Space Shuttle. In 1981, the first Space Shuttle launched. NASA kept launching the Space Shuttle very frequently throughout the early to mid-1980s, until the Challenger disaster occurred. The Space Shuttle Challenger exploded after a failure on one of its SRBs. It was a tragedy and the entire crew died. There was a plan to put Big Bird, yes, Big Bird, the Sesame Street character, on that very flight that exploded. They didn't even plan to put Brian Spinney, the man who plays Big Bird, on the shuttle. They wanted to put Brian Spinney on the shuttle in the full Big Bird costume. Luckily, the Big Bird costume would not fit in the seat. After the Challenger disaster, the Space Shuttle took months to be refurbished before it could fly again after each launch because of safety concerns. Around the same time, the Soviets built the Buran Energia. The Buran was a Soviet version of the space shuttle. It flew on the Energia rocket, which was meant to be the replacement for the N-1. The Buran did not do much. The Soviets also built their Mir space station, which was the largest space station of that time. The space shuttle launched the Hubble Space Telescope to examine far-off galaxies. By the year 1990, the Soviet Union had collapsed and the newly formed Russia and US were more willing to cooperate. In 1998, the US and Russia, as well as the EU, Japan, and Canada, decided to cooperate to build the International Space Station, or ISS for short. The ISS is an amazing work of engineering and has been used to conduct countless experiments. The space shuttle would be discontinued in 2011, and up until this year, as of writing this, American astronauts have had to fly to space on the Russian Soyuz. Today, things are changing in spaceflight. Elon Musk's SpaceX had created 4 reusable rockets that do not take months to refurbish like the space shuttle, making spaceflight much cheaper. SpaceX's Crew Dragon was the first rocket in 9 years to transport American astronauts to space from American soil. As it stands now, almost all spaceflight outside of Earth's sphere of influence is unmanned. Oh, I somehow completely forgot to mention the vast majority of unmanned spaceflight, so excluding what I've already talked about, here's a quick timeline of unmanned spaceflight. In 1960, America launched Pioneer 5, which became the first man-made object to be put in orbit with the Sun. The American OSO-1 became the first solar telescope. Ranger 4 was an American craft that crashed on the far side of the Moon. The American Mariner 2 was the first American craft to have a successful flyby of Venus. The Soviet Lunar 9 was the first object to land on the Moon. Venera 3 was the first object to crash into Venus. Luna 10 was the first satellite orbiting the Moon. The American Lunar 1 orbiter was the first object to map areas of the Moon. The Soviet Cosmos 186/Cosmos 188 were the first 2 unmanned crafts to dock together. The Soviet Zond 5 was the first craft carrying life to get a lunar flyby. The Soviet Venera 5 was the first craft to successfully use a parachute to land in Venus's atmosphere. The American Mariner 7 was the first craft to take a picture of the Martian moon Phobos. The Soviet Luna 16 was the first craft to take a surface sample from the Moon back to Earth. The Soviet Wukhod was the first rover on the Moon. The American Mariner 9 was the first object to get into orbit with Mars. The Soviet Mars 2 was the first object to crash on Mars. The Mars 3 was the first craft that had landed on Mars. The Pioneer 10 was the first craft to reach Jupiter and reached an escape velocity to leave solar orbit. Mariner 10 achieved both a Venus and Mercury flyby. Venera 9 achieved both the first orbit of Venus and the first pictures from the Venetian surface. The Helios 10 was a craft that had the closest orbit to the Sun. The Viking Lander was the first probe to take a solar sample of Mars. Voyager 1 would be the first object to leave the solar system and the fastest man-made object ever. Pioneer 11 would have the first flyby of Saturn. Venera 13 would take the first soil samples of Venus. The Soviet Vega 1 would be the first balloon deployed on Venus. Voyager 2 would be launched and would also escape the solar system. The Vega 1 and Vega 2 crafts would have the first flyby of Halley's Comet, followed by Europe's Giotto probe. The American Magellan 1 would embark on a multi-year mission to Venus. Galileo would be sent to Jupiter to study it and its moons. The American European Ulysses probe would be the first object to have a polar orbit around the Sun. The American Mars Pathfinder would be the first rover on Mars. Cassini-Huygens would be the first craft to get into an orbit around Saturn and later crash into that planet. Huygens would have a landing on the Saturn moon of Titan. The American Messenger probe would be the first object to orbit Mercury. The American Dawn probe would be the first to orbit the asteroid Vesta. Europe's Rosetta would land on on an asteroid. The New Horizons probe would have the first flyby of Pluto. The Chinese Chang'e 4 would be the first object to land on the dark side of the Moon. And in 2016, the Curiosity rover would land on Mars. Okay, I think that's it. So, we have talked about the past and the present, but what about the future? SpaceX is making their Starship, which is scheduled for 2024, that can go to the Moon and Mars, as well as short multi-hour-long flights on Earth to just 30 minutes or so. NASA's Perseverance rover will land on Mars this coming February, and by the next Mars season, ESA's sample return mission will become the first craft to take off from the surface of another planet. NASA is also building their SLS, which will take humans back to the moon by the mid-2020s. The European Space Agency will complete a launch of their Ariane 6 sometime soon, and there are plenty of emerging rocket companies like Astra and Blue Origin. Nobody can say what the future will hold. Will we colonize other planets? Who's to say? I hope you enjoyed this video.